In the latest chapter of the US-China trade war, tensions have reached an all-time high. President Trump's administration has now imposed a staggering 245% tariff on Chinese imports, following retaliatory actions from China that have rocked global trade. With both nations locked in a fierce economic battle, the question arises, how will this escalating crisis impact the world, and what does it mean for the future of international relations? In this report, we'll explore the unfolding crisis in China, the deepening protests against President Xi Jinping, and the growing economic strain that both countries are facing. The simmering trade war between the US and China has now escalated into a full-scale economic battle. In a dramatic turn, President Trump has imposed a staggering 245% tariff on Chinese imports, a move that is bound to send shockwaves through global markets. This drastic measure is a direct response to China's retaliatory tariffs and actions, marking a point of no return in what has already been one of the most heated and contentious trade conflicts in modern history. To fully understand the magnitude of this decision, it's essential to look at the broader context. The 245% tariff is not just a symbolic gesture, it's a declaration of economic war. This new policy comes on the heels of China's own retaliatory actions, which have already deeply impacted American businesses. In an effort to counterbalance the U.S. tariffs, China has halted orders of Boeing aircraft, one of the most high-profile exports from the U.S. to China, while simultaneously imposing 125% tariffs on a wide range of U.S. goods, from agricultural products to electronics. To the Trump administration, these tariffs are a necessary response to China's unfair trade practices, particularly its history of intellectual property theft, forced technology transfers, and trade imbalances. The White House argues that China has been manipulating global markets to its advantage for decades, taking advantage of U.S. manufacturing and intellectual property in ways that have hurt American industries and workers. But for all the rhetoric, the reality on the ground is far more complicated. These new tariffs are already having a profound impact on American businesses and consumers. For instance, industries that rely on cheap Chinese labor and materials, such as electronics, textiles, and manufacturing, are now facing skyrocketing costs. That cost is being passed on to consumers, pushing up prices for everyday goods and increasing the strain on middle-class Americans who are already grappling with stagnant wages and rising costs of living. Meanwhile, Chinese businesses that once flourished under the U.S. market are now facing the harsh reality of American tariffs. In China, the economic impact is being felt in every corner of the country. Exporters are seeing their shipments delayed or cancelled, as American consumers turn to other markets for cheaper alternatives. Small and medium-sized Chinese enterprises are suffering the most, with many forced to halt production or lay off workers as the demand for their products dries up. But despite the pain on both sides, the true damage is not just economic, it's geopolitical. China's response to these tariffs is not simply an economic one, it's deeply tied to national pride and political strategy. Xi Jinping has framed the trade war as a battle for China's sovereignty, portraying the U.S. actions as an attempt to stifle China's rise as a global power. This rhetoric is designed to rally the Chinese public behind the government and reinforce the narrative that the West is trying to impede China's legitimate growth. Xi Jinping has been quick to harness nationalism as a tool for political consolidation. In response to growing unrest and protests within China due to the economic strain of the tariffs, Xi's government has tightened its grip on public discourse. Protesters have been silenced, and any dissent has been framed as unpatriotic or in support of foreign interests. By doing so, the Chinese leadership hopes to maintain internal stability while facing the external pressure of these escalating tariffs. Internally, Xi's government is pushing the narrative that China will endure these hardships for the long-term gain. In his public speeches, Xi has repeatedly emphasized China's resilience and commitment to self-reliance. The Chinese Communist Party is positioning itself as the defender of China's future, insisting that China will continue to grow and prosper, regardless of the U.S. tariffs. But the road ahead is uncertain. While China may be prepared to endure short-term economic pain, the long-term effects of these tariffs could fundamentally alter the global economic landscape. As the trade war continues to deepen, businesses are looking for new markets, and consumers are beginning to feel the weight of rising prices. Global supply chains that once relied on China's cheap labor and efficient manufacturing are now being redirected to other regions, leading to further disruptions in the global economy. At the same time, the Chinese government is quietly working to strengthen its trade relationships with other nations. President Xi's recent diplomatic tour of Southeast Asia is a clear sign of China's efforts to diversify its economic partners. Through multilateral agreements and diplomatic initiatives, China is working to reduce its reliance on the U.S. and fortify its position in global trade. But even with these efforts, the shadow of the U.S. tariffs looms large, and China faces a tough road ahead. While the United States doubles down on its tariffs, China is not backing down. In fact, it is leveraging its most powerful tool, nationalism, to rally support for the Communist Party and President Xi Jinping. From speeches to state-controlled media campaigns, the message is clear: China will not bend to U.S. demands. Instead, it will endure these economic pressures with resolve and emerge even stronger. Xi's political playbook is a masterclass in nationalism. By framing the trade war as a battle for China's sovereignty, Xi has successfully transformed what could have been seen as an economic setback into a patriotic cause. He speaks of China's resilience, positioning the nation's hardship as a testament to its enduring strength. This message is being amplified through state-run media, which paints the U.S. as the aggressor and China as the victim, wronged by decades of exploitation under the guise of globalization. Xi Jinping's leadership is deeply tied to the narrative of China's resurgence on the world stage. Over the past decade, China has positioned itself as the world's second-largest economy, challenging the U.S. for global dominance in key industries. And now, in the face of the U.S. tariffs, Xi is framing this trade war as the final test of China's resilience and its rightful place in the international order. The Chinese government's defiance, however, is not without consequences. As domestic discontent begins to bubble over, particularly among the urban working class and factory workers hit hardest by the tariffs, Xi faces growing pressure to maintain his grip on power. But rather than soften his stance, Xi has doubled down, further entwining his leadership with the fate of the nation. Criticism from the Chinese public, especially those who feel the economic strain of these policies, is being met with severe crackdowns. The Chinese Communist Party has historically maintained tight control over dissent, and this time is no different. Protests against Xi's policies are swiftly silenced, with police forces moving in to disperse crowds before they can grow too large. But even as the government cracks down on protesters, it's clear that Xi's grip on the Chinese narrative is slipping in some areas. In a bid to strengthen his position, Xi has been careful to align himself with the national sentiment. He is using the tariffs as a rallying cry for unity, declaring that China's economy will weather the storm and that the Communist Party will lead the country through these turbulent times. But there is a growing concern among some of Xi's more moderate allies, those who see the risks of a prolonged trade war, that this rhetoric could backfire, leading to deeper economic wounds that could take decades to heal. Nevertheless, Xi's messaging is working for now. He has successfully mobilized a large portion of the Chinese population, convincing them that the U.S. is out to diminish China's rightful place in the world. In the media, Xi is portrayed as the steadfast leader, holding firm against foreign pressures. Nationalist fervor is at an all-time high, and for many Chinese citizens, the trade war has become not just an economic issue but a moral cause, a fight to defend China's dignity and future. But there is an inherent danger in using nationalism as a political tool. As the economic consequences of the tariffs continue to grow, Xi's ability to maintain this narrative may be tested. If the Chinese public begins to feel the deepening effects of unemployment, rising prices, and uncertainty, the party's grip on power could start to weaken. In times of crisis, no government, no matter how tightly controlled, can hold off dissatisfaction forever. Even so, the Chinese government is not giving up. As protests fade into silence and public anger simmers beneath the surface, the government is doubling down on its plan to reduce reliance on the U.S. market. President Xi has made it clear that China's long-term strategy involves diversifying trade partnerships, particularly in Southeast Asia, and positioning itself as the leader in the global economy. And while this may ease some short-term pressures, it's clear that China's economic future is now forever intertwined with the outcome of this bitter trade war. As the trade war intensifies and tariffs reach unprecedented levels, the effects of the US-China standoff are rippling across the globe. The Chinese economy, long seen as the world's manufacturing powerhouse, is facing an existential challenge. With the 245% tariff on Chinese imports crippling many of its key export industries, the global supply chain is under stress like never before. Before the tariffs, China was the world's go-to source for cheap goods, ranging from electronics to consumer products. Companies across the US, Europe, and other parts of the world relied on Chinese factories to supply affordable goods. But as the tariffs escalate, the relationship between China and these countries is becoming increasingly strained. The knock-on effects are now being felt in industries worldwide, from manufacturing to retail, and even technology. Chinese manufacturers, many of whom thrived under the previous trade terms with the US, are now struggling to keep up. Companies that once enjoyed streamlined access to American consumers are being forced to find new buyers, but this transition is easier said than done. The tariffs have driven up production costs, and global demand for Chinese goods is starting to decrease. As Chinese exports falter, the ripple effect on global markets is unavoidable. China's struggles are compounded by the larger economic ramifications of this tariff war. For the first time in decades, China's manufacturing sector is facing a serious decline. The country's once vibrant export market is faltering, and as a result, many Chinese companies are cutting jobs, closing factories, or shifting their operations to other countries. With rising costs and fewer buyers, small and medium-sized businesses, which form the backbone of China's economy, are bearing the brunt of the trade war. However, the effects of the tariffs aren't limited to China. The global supply chain is an interconnected web, and when one part falters, the entire system feels the tremor. U.S. retailers, from Walmart to Best Buy, are seeing their profit margins shrink as the cost of Chinese imports skyrockets. For many companies, the cost of doing business has jumped significantly, leading to higher prices for everyday consumers. The shift in tariffs is not only a Chinese issue, it's becoming a global issue. Retailers in the U.S. are already beginning to feel the squeeze. For example, Walmart, one of the largest retailers in the U.S., relies heavily on affordable imports from China to keep its prices competitive. As tariffs increase, the price of goods at Walmart and other major retailers is rising. This creates a problem for U.S. consumers who are already grappling with rising costs in nearly every aspect of their lives: gasoline, healthcare, and housing. The price of everything seems to be going up. The largest cost increases are seen in industries reliant on Chinese-made products, particularly electronics, textiles, and consumer goods. Smartphones, computers, and even clothing prices are jumping as tariffs are passed down to the consumer. For U.S. businesses that rely on affordable Chinese imports to keep prices low, the situation is becoming untenable. Yet, it's not just about price hikes, there are also logistical delays. The U.S. government's decision to impose 245% tariffs has led to significant delays in the shipping process. Shipping companies are being forced to reroute goods, and the result is a global backlog of trade. Ports in the U.S. are backed up, with containers sitting idle for weeks as customs and import restrictions grow stricter. For many businesses, delays in shipments mean lost sales, which can make or break their year. And the global implications don't stop at the US and China. Companies in Europe and Southeast Asia are also being affected by the disruptions in global supply chains. With China being a critical supplier of raw materials, electronics, and manufacturing, many European businesses are now looking for alternatives, sometimes turning to other countries in Southeast Asia, such as Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia. But the shift is not simple. These countries do not yet have the infrastructure or the manufacturing capacity to handle the volume of business that China once did. Ultimately, the tariffs are causing a major shakeup in global trade networks. With China and the US locked in this economic standoff, countries that once thrived under Chinese trade are now rethinking their dependence on Chinese manufacturing. But there is a catch: China's manufacturing base has been the engine of the world economy for decades. Shifting these global networks away from China to other regions will take time, money, and infrastructure development. And for many businesses, the shift to new suppliers may not be enough to mitigate the damage from the tariff increases. As the US-China trade war deepens, one thing is clear: the economic and political stakes are high, not just for China and the US, but for the entire global order. While both countries exchange blows through tariffs and sanctions, the impact of these decisions has sparked a significant shift within the internal dynamics of China itself. Amidst the growing economic strain and political tension, civil rights groups, labor unions, and grassroots activists within China are becoming an increasingly powerful voice for change. But can they hold sway against the Chinese Communist Party's strict grip on power? Internally, China has faced a growing wave of discontent as the economic fallout from the trade war begins to hit home. The government, led by President Xi Jinping, has sought to suppress public protests through a mix of state control and nationalistic rhetoric. The Chinese Communist Party, CCP, has positioned itself as the sole defender of China's future, urging the public to rally behind the idea of national resilience in the face of foreign adversity. However, the CCP's narrative of resilience and unity is increasingly challenged by the economic realities that millions of Chinese citizens face daily. As small businesses close, unemployment rises, and basic goods become more expensive, discontent is building. These frustrations have led to protests, with workers, students, and everyday citizens speaking out against both the economic hardships and the government's handling of the crisis. Despite the CCP's tight grip on power, civil rights organizations and labor unions are gaining influence, advocating for workers' rights and more inclusive economic policies. While these groups have historically operated under the radar, their efforts have become more visible as the economic pressure mounts. Activists are demanding more from the government, including transparency, better protection for the working class, and policies that truly benefit the majority rather than the elite few. In addition to labor unions, other civil rights organizations are pushing for greater political freedom and social justice. These groups see the trade war as an opportunity to amplify their message, not just about economic fairness, but also about fundamental human rights. With the increasing public pressure and growing international attention, these organizations are now gaining international allies who support their calls for reform. However, the Chinese government's response to these growing civil movements is swift and severe. Protest leaders are often detained, protests are forcibly shut down, and internet censorship is used to erase any trace of dissent. The government, under Xi Jinping's leadership, has shown little tolerance for criticism and is not hesitant to employ heavy-handed tactics to maintain control. But despite the heavy crackdown, the movement for change is not backing down. The 50501 movement, which has been gaining momentum worldwide, finds allies in the growing civil rights activism inside China. These activists, while facing tremendous risks, are using creative and clandestine means to organize and mobilize, inspired by international calls for justice and reform. And while their ability to challenge the government remains limited, their influence is growing. International pressure has also played a critical role in amplifying the voices of these Chinese activists. Global human rights organizations are speaking out against the CCP's crackdown, urging for more political freedoms, better working conditions, and an end to the suppression of free speech. The US and other Western nations have consistently called for greater transparency and reform within China, although these external pressures have yet to produce significant policy changes. One of the most significant outcomes of the global movement is the increasing spotlight on Xi Jinping's leadership. As his administration doubles down on the trade war with the US, both domestic and international pressure is forcing Xi to confront not just the economic ramifications of the conflict but also its impact on his political standing. While Xi continues to maintain control within China, the growing discontent and international scrutiny may soon reach a tipping point. As the US-China trade war rages on, its effects extend far beyond the borders of China and the United States. The escalating tariffs are reverberating through global markets, creating a new era of economic uncertainty. The interconnectedness of today's global trade system means that the fallout from this conflict is being felt across Europe, Africa, Asia, and beyond. Businesses, governments, and consumers are all grappling with the consequences of the US and China's battle for economic dominance. Europe, often seen as a neutral party in the trade war, is not immune to the economic fallout. As tariffs rise and supply chains are disrupted, European companies are facing higher costs and logistical challenges. Many businesses that rely on Chinese raw materials and goods for manufacturing are being forced to rethink their sourcing strategies. Some are shifting production to countries in Southeast Asia, while others are considering diversifying their suppliers to avoid over-reliance on China. Yet, the alternatives are far from ideal, as most Southeast Asian countries do not have the infrastructure or the labor force to replace China's manufacturing power. For many, the decision to move operations out of China is not just about cost, it's about future stability. U.S. companies, particularly in the tech and manufacturing sectors, are looking for alternatives in countries like Vietnam, India, and Mexico. But the reality is that while these countries can offer some cost savings, they cannot yet provide the scale or efficiency that China offers. The transition is not only costly but time-consuming, and for many businesses, the switch may not fully offset the rising costs of U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods. Meanwhile, China's growing trade partnerships with Southeast Asia, Africa, and South America are reshaping global alliances. In response to the tariffs, China has been actively courting countries in these regions, signing new trade agreements and creating new economic opportunities. President Xi Jinping's recent diplomatic visits to Southeast Asia are a clear signal of China's intent to diversify its economic relationships and reduce its reliance on the U.S. market. China is not only diversifying its trade relationships but is also positioning itself as a leader in global development. In Africa, China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, continues to build infrastructure projects across the continent, from railways to highways, establishing deep economic ties with resource-rich nations. As the U.S. pulls back from international development aid and global trade agreements, China is stepping in, using its economic clout to create a new network of global influence. China's engagement with Africa and other developing regions is not just about trade, it's about a long-term strategy to shift the balance of power in the global economy. By positioning itself as a leader in economic development and infrastructure, China is offering countries in the global south an alternative to U.S.-led trade policies. This growing influence could reshape the future of international trade, positioning China as the dominant economic force, particularly in the developing world. However, the road to a new economic order is not without its challenges. China's efforts to diversify its trade relationships are not foolproof. As global demand for Chinese goods decreases, the country's economic growth is slowing. The internal pressure on China to sustain its growth while dealing with the fallout from the trade war could eventually strain its ambitious plans. Even with new trade agreements and investments, China must confront the reality that its role in the global economy is fundamentally changing. And the U.S. is not without its own set of challenges. While President Trump has framed the tariffs as a victory for American workers, the reality is that the economic benefits of the tariffs are still unclear. Farmers in the U.S. are among the hardest hit, as China has reduced its purchases of U.S. agricultural products. In response, the U.S. government has been forced to bail out farmers, but these measures only provide temporary relief. The long-term economic impact on the American middle class, already under pressure from rising healthcare costs, wages stagnation, and housing instability, could be significant. Despite these challenges, President Trump remains resolute in his stance. He argues that these tariffs are a necessary step in addressing China's unfair trade practices, and he continues to push for a new deal that will benefit American workers. But as the trade war drags on, it's becoming evident that the costs of this conflict will be felt by both nations, and the global economy, for years to come. As the U.S.-China trade war deepens, China has been forced to adapt quickly, pivoting away from reliance on American markets. To soften the blow of the 245% tariffs and safeguard its economic future, China is increasingly turning its attention to other parts of the world, particularly Southeast Asia, Africa, and Europe. The trade war with the US may be shaking China's economic foundation, but Beijing is responding by strengthening ties with emerging markets and reshaping its global trade alliances. One of the most significant moves China has made in response to the tariffs is its deepening economic engagement with Southeast Asia. The region, once seen as an alternative production hub for U.S. businesses looking to avoid tariffs, is now becoming a key partner for China. Through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, China is investing heavily in infrastructure projects across Southeast Asia, forging stronger trade links with countries like Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia. Through the BRI, China is not just securing trade deals, it is securing long-term influence. The initiative allows China to extend its reach into developing countries by offering loans and financing for large-scale infrastructure projects. In return, these countries become increasingly reliant on Chinese investments, deepening China's political and economic influence over time. This strategy could potentially shift the balance of power in global trade away from the US and towards China. But China's strategy isn't just focused on Southeast Asia. In Africa, China has long been a dominant force, not only in trade but in development. Over the past 2 decades, Chinese companies have been responsible for building some of Africa's largest infrastructure projects. Now, with the US distracted by its ongoing trade war, China is seizing the opportunity to solidify its role as Africa's leading economic partner. In Africa, Chinese investments in infrastructure, mining, and energy projects are helping the continent modernize its infrastructure while simultaneously increasing China's economic and geopolitical leverage. As the US pulls back from global development efforts, China is stepping in, providing much-needed capital and expertise to countries that are desperate for growth. This has made China the top trading partner for many African nations, while the US lags behind in terms of influence. In Europe, the picture is slightly different, but no less significant. While the European Union is trying to maintain its traditional trade ties with the US, it's also increasingly open to working with China. Germany, Europe's largest economy, has been one of the strongest supporters of China's trade and investment policies. As the EU faces pressure from the US over tariffs, European companies are beginning to seek opportunities in China to secure their supply chains and manufacturing hubs. Germany is not alone. The EU, as a bloc, has been trying to balance its trade relationships with both the US and China. As the US continues to impose tariffs, European businesses are looking more and more to China for growth opportunities, particularly in the tech and automotive sectors. China, in turn, is seeking to deepen its ties with Europe, viewing it as an essential partner in maintaining its global economic dominance. But despite the deepening relationships between China and other regions, there is a significant cost to this shift in alliances. China's increasing economic ties with developing countries and Europe may offer short-term relief, but it is not a cure-all for the damage caused by the ongoing trade war with the US. Chinese businesses are facing rising production costs, especially in the wake of the US tariffs, and the country's heavy reliance on manufacturing exports leaves it vulnerable to global economic volatility. In the long run, China's efforts to diversify its trade relationships may cushion some of the blow from the US tariffs, but the cost of these new relationships could also weaken China's economic growth. As the world's second-largest economy, China must balance its need for global influence with the internal pressures of sustaining growth. And with the tariffs, slowing global demand, and political pressure mounting, China's leadership faces a precarious path ahead. As we've seen, the US-China trade war is far from just a bilateral dispute, it's a defining moment in global economic history. Both nations are reshaping not only their own futures but also the future of international trade. With China pushing to diversify its alliances, the global economic landscape is becoming more fragmented and complex. As the world's 2 largest economies battle it out, the consequences will be felt for decades to come, affecting not only businesses and governments but ordinary citizens across the globe. As China looks to expand its influence, the US continues to defend its economic interests, and other countries search for stability in uncertain times, it's clear that the world will never be the same. The global economy is entering a new era, one where competition for power and influence is reshaping trade, politics, and diplomacy. What happens next will set the stage for the coming decades, both for the US, China, and the rest of the world. The stakes are high, and the world is watching closely. To stay updated on the latest developments in the US-China trade war and how it's shaping the future of the global economy, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Like this video if you found this analysis insightful, and share it with others who need to understand the far-reaching impact of these economic tensions. Join the conversation in the comments below. What do you think the future holds for US-China relations, and how will the world respond? Stay informed, stay engaged, and be part of the global discussion.